My talk is concerned with a debate on the reality of witchcraft, which took place in Restoration England. So Joseph Glanvill and Margaret Cavendish are the main characters. Now, writing in 1666, Glanvill expresses his astonishment that men otherwise witty and ingenious are fallen into the conceit that there is no such thing as a witch or apparition, but that these are the creatures of melancholy and superstition. Now, Glanvill nowadays is probably best known for his work on witchcraft, but at the time he was a renowned advocate and early adopter of the new science. He was a member of the Royal Society, so he was had a much different reputation, I suppose, than he does nowadays. 2 years prior to this, Cavendish voices really strongly dissenting opinion. She says that there should be any such devilish witchcraft which is made by a covenant and agreement with the devil, by whose power men do enchant or bewitch other creatures, I cannot readily believe. Certainly I dare say that many a good old honest woman had been condemned innocently and suffered death wrongfully by the sentence of some foolish and cruel judges, merely upon the suspicion of witchcraft, when it's really there had been no such thing. So there was an exchange of letters between Glanvill and Cavendish. We only have Glanvill's letter nowadays, so Cavendish's letters were not preserved. So if we're going to judge what took place in their exchange, we have to use indirect evidence. And this is exactly what Jacqueline Broad did in her 2007 paper, and she came up with the following verdict. She said that Cavendish was the voice of scientific reason in their exchange. It's not just because she supports the conclusion that most scientists support today, there are no witches, but because her arguments point to the fact that Glanvill was practicing bad science by the light of his own principles. Now, Glanvill was a member of Royal Society. Cavendish, on the other hand, was vocal in her opposition to mechanical philosophy. She was also highly skeptical of experimental philosophy. So on the face of it, this should surprise us at least a little bit. Now she's the voice of scientific reason in their exchange. Now, I want to look into this disagreement that they had. We can't really look into the debate itself, but the disagreement. And I don't really buy into Broad's verdict here, but I want to try and argue and hopefully convince you a little bit by the end of this that we can view Cavendish as a voice of scientific reason, but in a very specific way and quite different from what Broad teases out. So in order to do this, let's look into what Glanvill was up to. Glanvill's argument for the reality of witchcraft is really, he uses several different argumentative strategies that kind of are supposed to work together. He answers all kinds of different objections. He collects examples and testimonies of poltergeists and witchcraft occurrences and so on. But Broad focuses on one aspect of his argumentation. And that's the part where Glanvill tries to convince us that witchcraft-related phenomena are conceivable and thus at least possible. And to do so, he engages in relating these hypothetical scenarios that are supposed to give us a taste, a flavor of what could be taking place when something like demonic possession occurs. So here's one example. Here, Glanvill talks about what is it that could be happening when a familiar, so a helper spirit, evil spirit, sucks on a part of witch's body, which was part of the lore of witchcraft, right? And he says, it's plain to conceive that the evil spirit, having breathed some vile vapor into the body of the witch, may taint her body and spirits with a noxious quality, by which her infected imagination, heightened by melancholy, of course, witches are melancholic and all that, and this worse cause may do much hurt upon bodies that are impressible by such influences. It is very likely that this ferment disposeth the imagination of the sorceress to cause separation of the soul from the body, and may perhaps keep the body in fit temper for its re-entry. So something really odd happens when a familiar sucks on a part of witch's body. Tales like these, tales of like witches flying to Sabbath, causing deadly disease simply by touch and so on, they seem so incredible that some people simply took it that they're just impossible, inconceivable. Now, to make them at least conceivable or possible, Glanvill gives us this. He goes through these sort of causal chains that involve natural causes, even materialist causes, that are, possible explanation what could be taking place. Perhaps the evil spirit breathes some vile vapor into witch's blood, and then it gets into her bloodstream, and maybe even causes separation of body and soul. Now, the problem with this, Broad points out, and she thinks that actually this is what Cavendish was onto in her criticism of Glanvill, is that if you engage in something like this, you don't actually increase the confidence in the belief that there are supernatural or immaterial, evil demons. What you actually do is lower that confidence. And so what Glanvill should have done, had he been a good, cautious 17th century scientific thinker, he should have just stopped short of affirming the existence of supernatural or immaterial spirits. And here's Broad. In his attempts to show that supernatural beings are conceivable, Glanvill thus ends up proving the very thing he denies, that we can conceive of the actions of witches in natural or material terms alone. By the light of his own principles, he ought therefore to have stopped short of affirming the probable existence of immaterial or supernatural beings. Now, I don't think things are this simple. Like I said, I don't really buy into this. And in order to show why, I think it would be helpful to look into what Glanvill says a witch is, to begin with. So a witch is one who can do or seems to do strange things beyond the known power of art and ordinary nature, by virtue of a confederacy with evil spirits. Strange things, not miracles. These are extraordinary effects of divine power. The witch occasions, but is not the principal efficient. She seems to do it, but the spirit performs the wonder. Sometimes immediately, as in transportations and possessions, sometimes by applying other natural causes, as in raising storms, inflicting diseases, using the witch as an instrument. So, first of all, Glanvill is certainly not in the business of showing that there are supernatural evil demons, right? He says right away, strange things, not miracles. Miracles this is just what God can do. We here have some really wondrous, extraordinary, exceedingly rare occurrences, but they're certainly not miracles. So nothing supernatural happens here. Still, Broad's charge says that, when he offers material causal chains, right, as a possible way in which demonic influence could take place, this is something that should lower our confidence that in belief that there are immaterial spirits, evil spirits. But I mean, there would be something odd about that, because he does say, the spirit performs the wonder sometimes immediately, or by applying natural causes. He's certainly building this concept of devil exacting his influence through natural and material causes into the very notion of what a witch is. Now, what I think is important to notice is that he talks here about witchcraft. Occurrences of this sort are confederacies of spirits with the witch, or witches. What he wants to show is that these confederacies are actually what takes place. And in order to do this, he needs to, or that's what he takes himself to be obliged to do, is to show that they're at least possible, right? They're at least conceivable. And to that end, he uses these examples, like possibly it could be some vile vapor that's being injected into witch's blood. So he's not, when giving these examples, he's not really after this goal of increasing confidence in belief that there are immaterial spirits. He just wants to increase the probability, or rather confidence in belief, that these confederacies of demons and humans do occur. Furthermore, it's telling, I think, how he uses an analogy or a parallel in a similar context. Glanvill talks about the soul-body interaction and union. And he says, we don't know how this takes place. We have no idea, right? But that doesn't stop someone like Descartes from speculating about how it is, what sort of a causal chain could lead from, the soul through pineal gland to some purely material effect. And I think that Glanvill considers himself equally entitled to hypothesize about the ways in which this confederacy between the devil and a human being could take place, even by natural means, as entitled as say, Descartes is when he speculates about how the soul and body are united. I mean, it's simply the very notion of an immaterial spirit is built into this whole conception of a witch. It's assumed from the outset. And just like Descartes doesn't really increase our confidence or doesn't strive to increase our confidence in the belief that there is an immaterial soul when he says, how it is that the soul via pineal gland and material spirits enacts physical effects. Similarly with Glanvill and with this confederacy of devil and man. So I reckon that what Glanvill is doing is not so internally unstable as an application of the methods of contemporary science, of his time, as Broad suggests. What he's trying to do, I think, is better framed in terms of, there's this kind of phenomena, this class of phenomena that is unexplained. He believes that it does occur. That's problematic, of course. It's very rare, wondrous, crazy, whatnot. But there are many other things like that. Like there's gravity, there's interaction of body and soul. There are all these kinds of things that we don't know causes for, but still reputable science can explore them. And he wants to put witchcraft on the same footing. He wants to put, he was sort of urging Royal Society to start investigating witchcraft. So I think, even though, I think Broad is onto something with her analysis, but ultimately I don't think it gets at the real issue, the real disagreement between Cavendish and Glanvill. In order to get to that, I think it's helpful to slightly reframe the context within which we're considering their disagreement. And I want to look into some sort of recent developments in history of science. So the work by people like James Henry and Stuart Clark, who have argued, I think pretty forcefully and persuasively, for the conclusion that in the period spanning Renaissance and 18th century, there was this very lively interchange between the new science and the old traditions, the traditions of, like magical traditions, occultist traditions, and such. In their view, in Henry's view in particular, what took place was that people who were sort of trying to, who had really strong reformist ambitions, they were sometimes, some of them, they weren't really scared to dip into these other traditions and to borrow from them and even to import into science. And what happened really in this period was that some of the magical tradition, in particular natural magic, was to an extent absorbed by science. So what is it that he has in mind? So for instance, natural magic, as it was understood at the time, was this kind of set of arts and sciences that, long story short, bodies have these occult qualities due to which they're capable of influencing one another in various ways, and then bringing them together or separating them and bringing about through that bringing together and separation, certain effects was one of the main ways in which this magical knowledge was made use of. So magical tradition is full of talk about sympathy and antipathy between bodies. And Henry shows that people like Robert Hooke and Isaac Newton actually adopted sort of this kind of talk with minimal changes. Like Hooke talks about congruences and incongruences between bodies. Newton talks about sociability and unsociability of chemicals. You know, like when you put two chemicals together, sometimes nothing happens. But sometimes you get a really, you know, like exciting, even violent reaction. So that type of thing was brought into the new science. A mainstay of magical tradition, natural magic, was action at a distance, right? Which found its way into new science via force of gravity. Now, what I think is really interesting is that this redrawing of boundaries, right? Science kind of adopting and blending in certain aspects of magical tradition, such as natural magic, but shunning others, such as demonology, such as symbolic magic, and so on. We find that in Cavendish in an admirably forthright way, and completely, it's in the open, right? Not everyone was ready to do that kind of thing, but with her we get something like this. And this quote immediately precedes the one that you saw earlier, when she rejects devilish witchcraft. And she says, "My opinion of witches and witchcraft in brief is this. My sense and reason doth inform me that there is natural witchcraft, as I may call it, which is sympathy, antipathy, magnetism, and the like, which are made by the sensitive and rational motions between several creatures." Her explanation, I'll get to this, ultimately of this type of phenomena will be materialistic. But these motions, being sometimes unusual and strange to us, we not knowing their causes, do stand amazed at their working power. And by reason we cannot assign any natural cause for them, or apt to ascribe their effects to the devil. So, Cavendish was deeply dissatisfied with mechanical philosophy. She didn't like the account of motion, she didn't like the account of transfer of motion, she didn't like the account of sensation, of cognition. Pretty much, she had enough of it, right? And she wasn't afraid to dip into this type of thinking, right? To endorse something like sympathy and antipathy. So sympathy plays it's all over. It's really commonplace in her work. When she talks about, the lodestone and iron, when she talks about the cohesion of parts of body, she invokes sympathy, and so on. So it's really everywhere in her work. Now the question is, what is it that makes her stop short of accepting the rest of that tradition? Why doesn't she go on and say, yeah, the devilish witchcraft is also fine? What is it about it that she finds sort of unbearable about it? Here I think the explanation has to go to her metaphysics, right? Cavendish is a very rare example of a 17th century materialist. And she's quite clear about it. I mean, Hobbes is a huge influence on her, although her materialism, of course, being an opponent of mechanical philosophy, it has to be a lot different than Hobbes is. But ultimately, she believes that all there is to nature is just material bodies. Now, this matter that she has in mind, it's not the inert matter of Descartes and Hobbes, not matter that requires external source of motion, for instance. She thinks that motion is inherent to matter, and she also thinks that matter is perceptive and rational. Matter can have knowledge. So she couples this view of matter with an occasionalist account of causation. So we have this picture where there are all these bits of matter that are capable of moving themselves, of causing their own motion, of perceiving other parts of matter, of having knowledge of how the other parts of matter are moving, and then of adjusting their own motion with the motion of these other parts of matter. Now, when you have something like that, when you have this kind of worldview in place, you don't really have any need for, Rafe Cudworth's Plastic Natures, Henry Moore's Spirit of Nature, no need for immaterial intermediaries between God and matter, nothing like that. No immaterial agent that puts matter in motion or something of the sort. No need for immaterial stuff whatsoever. And so by extension, there's no need for anything like, spirits that would explain certain phenomena. And I think that's where her disagreement with Glanvill ultimately lies. I believe natural magic to be natural corporeal motions in natural bodies. That's Cavendish. Not that I say nature is in herself magicianous, but it may be called natural magic or witchcraft, merely in respect to our ignorance. For though nature is old, yet she's not a witch, but a grave, wise, methodical matron, ordering her infinite family, which are her several parts, with ease and facility, without needless troubles and difficulties. This old matron is material through and through. All that's natural must be material or corporeal. And even angels and devils are ultimately material, because Scripture is never really says that they're not. And heaven and hell are described to be material, so perhaps spirits are too. So I think this is right. This is the source of her disagreement. There's no, I mean, the whole argument about whether confederacies of spirits and humans take place doesn't even take off, because there are no spirits. We have no need for spirits. They're completely thrown out. And what I think ultimately, and I'll conclude with this, is that here's a sense in which we can say that Cavendish is a voice of scientific reason. Like I said, a different sense from the one that Broad teased out. Namely, she is the voice of scientific reason in the sense that she gets it exactly right, so to speak. Like given this story about what was adopted from magical tradition and what was left aside, she gets it exactly right? Natural magic is fine. Sympathy and antipathy are fine. Action and distance, all that stuff is okay. Demonology is not. And I think it's also interesting that her materialism plays a huge role in this, and it's probably interesting to explore to what extent these changes in, or rather this process of absorbing parts of magical tradition but rejecting others has to do with materialist tendencies of thinkers at the time. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks. This is a very interesting very interesting case. So one thing that, I don't know the case and literature, but it seems to me that you're right that the way that he argues his case is not unscientific in terms of like the usual methodology, as you said, because we can believe that there's a certain phenomenon, right? We know that it exists, and then we don't know how to explain it really, like, gravitation or... But it seems to me there is another sort of part of the debate that, as you were sort of explaining it, became clear to me at least. So if we have like a group of scientists at that time, right? Their belief about the demons and the existence of witchcraft, the degree of their belief in conviction will vary. So hers is at 0, right? His may be moderate, strong, or weak. There is also nothing unscientific about that too, because you could be an archaeologist who believes that there is Atlantis existed, or think that that's complete rubbish. But typically you want to leave, somebody who has some conviction, and go, or like giant squids. It turned out that they actually exist, and so it seems to me that it's important to decide or to determine, maybe from the letters, how convinced he was that witchcraft actually exists. And that might be a very important part of the disagreement, actually, between them, not only about the explanation of the...
Good, thanks. So yeah, that's an interesting question. There's certainly a scale. There's people like Robert Boyle who only endorses belief in witchcraft basically in correspondence, but he also kind of coaxes Glanvill to go about and collect these testimonies, because if you find one really authentic case, that's it. In science, that's everything. And there are people like Glanvill who really take their time and make huge efforts to show that witchcraft is real. But still, I'm not sure. He is perfectly aware of the fact that there are many false testimonies. He knows that it's very likely that many of these testimonies are false. He knows that people are convicted, unfairly and so on. But he's ultimately motivated by religious motivations, because he thinks, and there are places where he expresses this, if you deny the reality of witchcraft, you're on a slippery slope to atheism. And that's basically, that's the danger that he's really concerned with. So it's hard to pin him down, you know, like how convinced he is. He might not be that convinced, but...
It's also hard to pin down, like, what's scientific or non-scientific.
Right.
I mean,
yes, yeah, that too.
For believing something can be...
Right.
You know,
And I mean...
giant squid, you know.
Yeah.
I like giant.
Right. But I mean, More and Glanvill, when they write, they do a lot of these things that really look like you know, like cutting edge contemporary science. And they even give criteria for, you know, like what is it that makes these testimonies plausible? You know, disinterestedness, corroboration by multiple witnesses, real effects that are publicly available, and so on. They do this Baconian, basically, science when they collect all these testimonies, and they take care, you know, like not to kind of separate good ones from bad ones. So they do a lot of that, you know. But yeah, their motivation, I don't think, is you know, like purely scientific, and whatever that might mean.
My question is really brief. So, and you just mentioned Francis Bacon. So I was wondering if she was, you mentioned she was influenced by Hobbes. Obviously, she was materialist through and through. But Francis Bacon had his idea how, he used the term natural magic as well. So he said applied physics is mechanics. So that's kind of this mechanistic philosophy that she didn't really buy into. But applied metaphysics is natural magic. So that's an interesting concept that he used. What he meant by that could actually be everything that she meant, meaning, he thought that if we knew the laws of things, conditions under which they occur, and so on, we could make gold. And that would be natural magic, but it's something. So I'm just thinking whether she was maybe familiar with Bacon's writings, maybe that was maybe the tradition she took. If you can tell by the text that you read.
She was aware of Bacon, but she responded much less to his work than say to Hobbes's. She was, I mean, a lot of what she was doing was just to engage in conversation with great philosophers of the time. So it was, you know, it was Descartes, it was Hobbes, it was More, it was von Helmont, and so on. Bacon, not so much. Yes.